The afternoon settled over the Kansas plains with a steady calm that felt older than the fields themselves. Faint light pressed through thin clouds and laid a pale sheen across the wooden shingles of a farmhouse that had weathered many seasons. Inside that house, an attic door waited at the end of a narrow hallway, its paint chipped, its hinges known for a tired creak. Helen stood before it with her hand on the knob and the kind of steady breath that comes from years of doing what must be done. Grief had visited and moved on, but it had left drawers that stuck, a staircase that groaned, and rooms filled with objects that asked to be remembered. She had delayed this work for months. The wind moved along the boards of the roof, and the smell of cedar drifted down the stairs, as if inviting her to climb. She did not look for courage in grand gestures. She simply turned the knob and stepped upward into dust and quiet. The attic carried the smell of old trunks and fabric, kept far past fashion. Dust gathered in slow layers on a wooden rocking horse, on a lamp with a dented shade, on a sewing table that still held a jar of buttons sorted by patient hands. Light entered by way of a small window whose glass had rippled with time, and that light cut a thin lane across the floor and the faces of stored objects. Helen paused at the top step and allowed her eyes to adjust. The slow pulse of the house could be felt through the floorboards. It was a familiar rhythm that had carried birthdays and winter illnesses and the hush of nights that asked for prayer. She took a rag from her pocket and began to move boxes, not with urgency, but with the steady pace of someone who understands that much of life is maintenance. She brushed dust from the lids and traced labels written in the careful hand of a younger self. Trunks yielded quilts whose edges had been mended in small, faithful stitches. Thermoses from picnics that had once listened to summer insects. A straw hat saved from a fair long forgotten. These objects did not shout. They held their meaning in quiet ways, as if memory itself worked best when given room. Helen shifted a stack of hymnals and found a wooden chest tucked behind an old wardrobe. The chest was out of place, older than the others, with a surface worn smooth by hands that had carried it across distances she could not know. The clasp was rusted but not locked. She set both palms on the lid and lifted. Cloth lay on top, folded and thinned by age. Under the top layer waited an envelope whose edges had darkened, the paper softened by years of holding back what it contained. The name on the front matched the one on her driver's license and on her marriage certificate and on the Bible in the front room. The handwriting was not the one that had left notes by the coffee pot or lists on the refrigerator. It reached from farther back. She carried the envelope toward the sliver of light and sat on a low chest. Her hands did not rush. Grief had taught her that speed could be a kind of fear. The seal lifted with a dry sound that belonged to another decade. Inside lay a letter written in a steady hand that did not apologize for its clarity. The first line addressed her with tenderness, and the name at the end belonged to a season before marriage and mortgages and harvest schedules. Samuel had written from a place that held long roads and the smell of rain on dust. He wrote of returning, of a plan that depended on time and mercy. He wrote of a promise kept through distance and uncertainty. The date sat just weeks before the day she had put on a simple dress and spoken vows that shaped everything that followed. Paper held the shape of a life that might have been, and Helen felt the weight of it settle in her chest in a way that was neither accusation nor regret. It was simply truth. She set the letter across her lap and remained still. The house listened with her. Cicadas began their afternoon song and the rafters answered with their familiar groan. She placed the first letter back into its envelope and lifted the rest of the cloth. More envelopes waited below, some tied with a narrow length of faded ribbon, others stacked as if they were meant to be read in order, but never were. The addresses belonged to years when she lived 3 streets from the church and walked past a post office window with a bell on the door. Her name appeared in the same steady hand again and again. The postmarks drew a line through seasons that had already happened and could not be returned to. A person cannot walk back into a day and ask for a different turn. A person can only stand in the present and decide what to do with what the day brings. Helen stacked the letters in a careful row near the window. She read the second, then the third. The sentences were plain and full, like a well-built fence that holds its shape season after season. They spoke of work found and then lost. They spoke of an acreage rented for a year in a Missouri hollow, where the soil ran a little thin but still answered to patient hands. They spoke of a belief that some seeds take longer to break the surface and show green. They spoke of her in ways that did not require ornament. Kindness was named as a strength and steadiness as a light. Faith was described not as a feeling, but as a way of standing up each morning and doing the next right thing. With each page, she felt the shape of her past shift by 1 degree, not in a way that erased what she had lived, but in a way that asked for room beside it. She remembered the day her father had closed the front door with a firm hand after a uniformed boy delivered a telegram down the street. She remembered the look that passed between adults whose decisions felt like weather, undeniable, impersonal, beyond appeal. She remembered thinking that love could be folded once and then once more and placed at the back of a drawer, and that a person could then continue with a good life. Years had blessed that belief with proof. A good man had sat at the head of the table. A harvest had brought grain enough to pay for repairs. Children had come and grown and left. Sorrow had arrived and made its bed in a corner, and then, by degrees, had learned to keep quiet. Now here she sat, in a room that smelled of cedar and warm dust, with letters that asked to be known. She read until her eyes stung. The light off the fields dimmed, and the narrow window cooled to a quiet grey. When she lifted the ribboned stack, a small photograph slid forward and rested against her knee. The image was worn at the edges. A young man with a hat stood near a fence that had been repaired in a practical way. A child perched on the top rail with a steady balance that suggested a boy used to boards and weather. The boy's face bore an arrangement of features that was not foreign to her. The eyes carried a set she had known well in a mirror that had sat on a dresser in a south-facing bedroom. On the back, a hand had written a county and a year and a line that pulled the breath from her in a single small gasp. The sentence was simple. It did not explain more than it had to. It did not reach for drama. It simply offered a fact that tied two lives with a thread she had never seen. She placed the photograph flat on the chest and steadied herself by fixing her gaze on the grain of the wooden floor. Lines ran in patient patterns, like rows in a field that had been tilled by hands that believed in seasons. A person can live a whole life with the sense that things are settled, only to learn that part of the story was stored one floor above, quiet and waiting. She did not resent the years she had lived. She did not distrust the love that had held that house together in winter storms and during springs that brought river water too close to the porch. She did not blame faces that were no longer here to answer. She simply acknowledged a fact that had crossed a wide distance to stand before her. She had been loved by a young man who had left and returned and written. She had married a good man who had built a dependable life with her. The envelope in her hands did not require tearing down one truth to make room for another. It required a larger table. She gathered the letters into a clean bundle and carried them down the stairs with the care one gives to a sleeping child. The kitchen held the smell of wood smoke. The clock kept its faithful count, and the enamel sink caught the light in a soft shine. She laid the letters on the table beside a cup whose ring had marked that surface many times. She lit a lamp against the growing grey and opened the family Bible on the sideboard. The book recorded births and baptisms and storms that had earned a line because they had brought the river across the road. She traced names and dates with a fingertip that had shelled peas and mended cuffs and turned soil in spring. Under her own name, a faint entry sat like a word half erased. The ink had grown thin, but had not gone. The line noted an infant and a month many decades behind her. The room held still. The lamplight wavered once and then steadied. She closed the book with both hands and kept them there, as if blessing everything it contained. She did not decide everything at once. She brewed coffee and sat and allowed her mind to step from stone to stone across a stream of years. The face in the photograph rose again. The county name on its back pointed toward a road she could drive, and the letters on the table offered a map drawn in paragraphs. She did not build an argument. She watched a path appear. It began in an attic, ran past a courthouse ledger, and continued toward a rural hollow where fields likely still leaned into a hill and a porch faced west for evening light. She would go there, not because she sought to undo anything, not because she wished to fill the air with accusations that could not change the past. She would go because truth is a form of mercy, and mercy asks to be received as well as given. She would go because love, when real, learns how to make room. That night the farmhouse settled with the old creaks that had never meant anything bad. Rain moved lightly across the roof as if blessing the day's discovery without ceremony. Helen placed the photograph back into its envelope and slid the first letter beside it. She tied the bundle with a narrow ribbon and placed it in her bag along with a copy of the record from the family Bible and a page she had torn from a county map. She looked around the kitchen at the tools and cups and aprons that had held her through many seasons. She turned off the lamp and allowed the dark to loosen the day's hold. Sleep came in measured stretches, interrupted by images that did not frighten or press. They simply showed roads and fields and a mailbox with a name that might match the one on the back of the photograph. Morning would come. The truck would start. The road would wait with the patience of gravel and fence lines and long horizons. She would drive toward a truth that had chosen to arrive late, and she would meet it with steady hands. Shadows lifted from the fields before the sun appeared. Birds moved along the fence posts with the casual confidence of creatures who trust the day. Helen rose, folded a sweater, and placed it on the seat beside her bag. She checked the truck's fuel with the practiced glance of someone who had never minded doing such things herself. The farmhouse stood behind her with a shape that had always looked like shelter rather than show. She locked the front door, not as a rejection of the past it contained, but as a promise to return and set each letter in its place when the new shape of her story had room for them. The road met her tires with a quiet hum, and the fields widened until sky and earth touched all around. She drove with both hands steady on the wheel, and her eyes set forward, not rushing, not lingering, moving at the honest pace of a person who has decided to do what is right and to do it with peace. The day stretched open. The truth waited down the road. The season ahead would ask for courage and offer grace. The road from Helen's farm to the county seat ran straight for 12 miles before curving through a cluster of oak trees that had survived storms stronger than memory. The sky carried a pale brightness that made the world look freshly washed. The air was cool enough to remind her that autumn would soon take hold. Dust lifted behind the truck like a small ghost following its keeper. She had folded the first letter in her coat pocket. It pressed lightly against her side each time the truck hit a bump, as if insisting she remember what she was carrying. The road was familiar, but the reason for traveling it was not. She had driven this way countless times for supplies, for church gatherings, for visits to the doctor when her knees had begun to ache, but never to look for a past that had quietly rewritten itself. The courthouse stood on the same corner it always had, its bricks darkened by weather and years of courthouse steps bearing the weight of farmers, preachers, and families who came to sign papers that bound or released them. She parked by the curb and sat for a moment before stepping out. The envelope in her coat pocket warmed against her body like a living thing. Inside, the words waited, unchanged since the day they had been written, yet still shaping what came next. She crossed the street, opened the heavy wooden door, and entered a hall that smelled of paper, polish, and time. Behind the counter sat a clerk whose hair was silver and whose eyes still carried the sharp patience of someone who had worked decades in this same room. His nameplate read Howard M. Keller, and Helen recognized it, though she hadn't seen him in years. He greeted her kindly, asking if she was there for property records or tax rolls. She shook her head. Her voice came quiet, but steady. Birth records, October of 1948. The sound of the year seemed to pull something out of the air itself, an echo that had waited too long to be heard. Mr. Keller led her to a side room lined with ledgers. The pages inside carried dust older than some lives. He opened one with careful hands and turned it toward her. "They're in order by date," he said. Helen traced the lines of names until she found what she feared and needed at once. Whitmore, Helen, male infant, Samuel Reed. The letters blurred for a moment before settling back into shape. The clerk spoke softly. "That was a quiet case," he said. "I remember hearing something about it. Record sealed by request of your father." Helen looked up. "He sealed it himself?" "Yes, ma'am. Said the child didn't live long. Paperwork matched, but—" He hesitated, then tapped the edge of the page. "There was never a death record filed. I remember because that line always stayed open." Her hands tightened on the ledger's edge. She thanked him and copied the entry into her notebook, writing each letter with care, as though repeating the truth would help it settle inside her. When she left the courthouse, the light outside felt too bright, and the town too still. The world had gone on believing one story, while another had waited quietly under a layer of ink. She drove past the post office, the church, the empty lot where the feed store used to stand. Each place carried echoes of the years she had lived in certainty. At the edge of town, she slowed near a small graveyard enclosed by a low stone wall. It was where her parents rested, and where her husband's name shared a headstone with her own, carved years before it would need the second date. She parked under a willow tree and stepped out. The wind lifted the loose ends of her scarf and scattered fallen leaves across the ground. She stood before her father's grave for a long time, not in anger, but in the quiet confusion of someone confronting a story rewritten by the very hands that once guided her. She spoke softly, not expecting an answer. "You thought you were protecting me. Maybe you believed sorrow could be hidden the way you hide tools in a shed. But truth has its own patience." The silence that followed carried no reply, yet it felt lighter, as if something unspoken had finally been shared between them. She turned away and looked toward the fields beyond the stone wall. The land was wide and forgiving, ready to hold another harvest, no matter what had grown there before. Back home, the letters still waited on her table. She laid out each one in the order of its postmark. The handwriting changed slightly over the years, strong at first, then slower, more deliberate. In one, Samuel wrote of a boy learning to walk and of how his laughter filled a house that had once been too quiet. In another, he mentioned sending a photograph to prove what hope looked like when it learned to stand on two legs. Helen unfolded that photograph again. The boy's small hands gripped the fence rail, his expression full of the kind of determination that belongs to children who learn early that the world can be kind and unkind at once. Behind him, Samuel's face carried pride that needed no words. The line on the back, "Your son looks just like you," now felt less like surprise and more like a message Samuel had intended for her future self. She read until the letters blurred and her eyes ached. Each word seemed to close the space between past and present. Her kitchen filled with the smell of coffee that had gone cold. The clock struck 5. She thought of her daughters, both living their own quiet lives miles away. They believed their father had been the only man who ever wrote her letters. They believed the attic held only furniture. They believed everything was known. She wondered what she would tell them when the time came. At dusk, she took the stack of letters to the porch. The fields stretched golden under the sinking light. She ran her thumb along the paper edges, feeling the texture of what time had tried to erase. Her thoughts turned toward the name in the county record, James. That single word had redrawn the lines of her history. Somewhere in Missouri, perhaps only a few counties away, there might be a man with her eyes, her voice, her quiet way of standing still before deciding anything. She returned inside and lit a lamp. The evening shadows deepened, gathering in corners where silence liked to rest. She wrote a note on a piece of plain paper, Boone Hollow, Missouri. Check records. Ask about Samuel Reed. She pinned it above the kitchen table, beside the calendar, whose pages still carried the marks of a life built on habit and small faithfulnesses. That night, sleep came slow. When it did, it brought dreams of roads lined with cornfields and faces half recognized from memory. Each dream carried the same soft voice that said, "Keep going." Morning came with a wind that carried the smell of earth. Helen folded a sweater into her bag and set the photograph inside her Bible. Before locking the door, she looked around the house one last time. The worn furniture, the clock that never missed a beat, the stove that had fed family and neighbors alike. Everything here had held her story. Now It would wait for her to bring back its missing chapter. The drive toward Missouri stretched long and steady. Hills rolled gently, dotted with barns whose paint had faded to the color of soft clay. She passed fields where workers bent close to the ground, tending to rows that reached toward harvest. Each mile carried her farther from the version of herself that believed all questions had been answered. Each mile carried her closer to the one truth that had refused to stay buried. By late afternoon, she reached a sign that read, Boone Hollow, Pop. Ebano 214. The town sat quiet under the sun, its single gas station casting a long shadow across the road. She parked near the general store and stepped out. The air smelled of hay and distant rain. Across the street, an older man sat on a bench whittling wood. He looked up and nodded in polite greeting. "Afternoon," he said. "Afternoon," she answered. "I'm looking for someone. Maybe you can help me." He set the knife aside and listened. "What name?" "Reed," she said. "James Reed." The man thought for a moment, tapping the knife against his knee. "Reed Farms down near the old river road, about 3 miles out. Big white house with a porch. You'll see it before you smell it. He burns hickory wood year-round." Helen thanked him, returned to her truck and sat still for a moment. The sun had begun to tilt west, turning the sky a pale amber. The air through the open window felt cool against her hands. She started the engine. The road ahead narrowed, framed by trees whose branches met above like an archway. Gravel cracked softly under her tires. With each turn, she felt the years peel back, not erased, but understood in a new way. The letter in her pocket pressed gently against her once more. When the house appeared in the distance, white against the gold of the fields, she slowed. A windmill turned slowly behind it, creaking with the rhythm of a life that had gone on without her. Smoke rose from a chimney, curling into the evening sky. She stopped at the gate. The mailbox read James Reed. Her breath caught. The world around her seemed to hold its breath too. The porch light flickered on. A man stepped outside, wiping his hands on a rag. His hair was grey at the temples, his posture steady. For a moment he simply looked toward the road, curious but calm. Helen gripped the steering wheel, then released it. She opened the door and stepped out. The gravel crunched under her shoes. The wind moved softly through the wheat, carrying the faint scent of hickory smoke and the promise of something long delayed, finally ready to be spoken. Where in the world are you watching from? Leave it down below in the comments. The first few steps Helen took toward the porch felt like crossing a bridge that had waited half a lifetime to be walked upon. Gravel shifted under her shoes, and each sound seemed to echo louder than it should have. The man on the porch, James Reed, watched her with the calm politeness of someone used to strangers turning up for directions or church donations. The evening light drew long shadows across the yard, and the smell of hickory smoke mingled with the sweetness of cut hay from the nearby field. When Helen stopped at the gate, her breath came slow and deliberate. She was standing before a door she had never knocked on, though some part of her soul had been moving toward it for decades. He stepped closer to the railing, his hands resting on the wood, eyes squinting slightly against the light. "Can I help you, Mum?" His voice carried the gentle rasp of a man who had worked the land, one used to speaking over the hum of wind and distance. Helen swallowed hard and felt the letter in her pocket press against her chest like a heartbeat not her own. "I believe you might know someone named Samuel Reed," she said. The name left her lips softly, but it seemed to linger in the air between them. A flicker passed over the man's face. His eyes, though aged by years, lit for a moment with recognition and something else, curiosity, maybe disbelief. "That was my father," he said after a pause. "He's been gone some time now." Helen nodded slowly. The world seemed to tilt just slightly, enough to remind her that she was standing inside a truth too large to absorb at once. "I knew him," she said simply. "A long time ago." James stepped down from the porch and came closer, the evening light outlining the steady lines of his face. Up close, Helen saw it clearly, the same eyes that looked back at her from the photograph, the same determined shape of jaw she had once known in another man. He carried himself with a quiet steadiness that needed no announcement. Her hands trembled at her sides, but she kept her voice calm. "I found some letters," she continued. "They were meant for me. They were hidden in my attic for over 50 years. James's brow furrowed, his gaze steady steady but unreadable. "Letters from my father?" She nodded. "And a photograph." She reached into her bag and took out the small envelope. The photo slid into her palm, its edges worn smooth. She handed it to him without a word. James held it carefully, turning it toward the fading light. The image captured his father in younger years, standing near a fence, holding a boy, himself. He stared at it for a long time. "I've seen this before," he said quietly. "It used to sit on his nightstand. He never told me where it came from. When I asked, he'd just say it was a reminder." Helen's throat tightened. A reminder of what? James looked at her then, his eyes searching hers, with the measured patience of someone sensing that the answer was far larger than the question. "Of someone he couldn't forget, I suppose," he said. For a moment neither spoke. The fields around them rustled with a soft wind, and somewhere a dog barked in the distance. It was as if the land itself knew something sacred was taking place in that quiet exchange. Helen drew a slow breath and said, "I think there's something I need to tell you, but I don't know if I should do it standing out here." James motioned toward the porch. "Please," he said gently, "come inside. You've come a long way." The house smelled faintly of pine and old books. A clock ticked on the mantel, the same steady rhythm that seemed to exist in every home built before convenience replaced patience. Photographs hung along the hallway, children, grandchildren, gatherings under trees and porches. Helen followed him into the kitchen, where the light from the window cast a soft glow over the wooden table. He gestured for her to sit. She placed her bag on the floor beside her chair and folded her hands on the table, steadying them. "I don't know how much you've been told about your early years," she began, "or about how you came to live here." James leaned back slightly, his hands clasped in front of him. "Not much," he said. "My father never spoke of my mother, said it was a chapter best left to time. I figured she passed when I was born. That's what folks around here always assumed." Helen looked down, her eyes filling before she could stop them. "That's what I was told too," she whispered. "Only I wasn't the one who passed. It was the truth that did." James tilted his head, his expression softening. "What do you mean?" She met his eyes. "I'm your mother, James." The words came out steady but quiet, like a confession given to the air rather than the man before her. Silence followed, long and full, the kind that seems to slow the world until even the smallest sound feels loud. The clock ticked once, twice. James didn't move at first. His eyes stayed fixed on her face, studying it as if trying to see through time. The truth hung between them like a heavy curtain that neither dared to touch. Helen didn't speak again. She had said all there was to say. The rest had to settle on its own. Finally, James set the photograph on the table and rubbed his hands over his face. When he spoke, his voice was lower, softer. "You're saying my father, Samuel, he took me because he thought you'd never know?" Helen nodded. "He didn't take you. He saved you. I was told you hadn't survived. My father, your grandfather, made sure I believed it. He thought he was protecting me. Samuel must have learned the truth later. He raised you the best he could." James exhaled deeply, his gaze dropping to the photograph again. "He did," he said. "He worked long hours. We didn't have much, but he made sure I never went without. He used to tell me that love was work, that it wasn't something you said, but something you kept doing no matter what it cost you." Helen smiled faintly, her tears shining under the light. "That sounds like him." They sat quietly for a while, letting the truth find its place in the room. The wind outside had softened, and the last of the daylight painted the window panes with gold. James finally broke the silence. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. "You don't have to say anything," Helen said gently. "I just wanted to see you, to know you lived. That's enough for me." But she could see it, the conflict in his eyes, the careful weighing of years built on one story now shifted by another. He looked at her again, longer this time, and something in his expression changed. "You have the same hands," he said softly. "I never knew where I got them from." He'd always say, "You've got your mother's hands." Helen's breath trembled. "And you have his eyes," she whispered. The moment stretched, fragile but whole, the kind of moment where words stop being necessary because something deeper has already begun to mend. James leaned back, his gaze drifting toward the window. "I always thought about her, you know," he said. "Not in detail, just a feeling, like a shadow of someone I couldn't remember, but also couldn't forget. He smiled faintly, a line of light catching the corner of his eye. Guess that feeling had a reason. Helen nodded, her heart full of both ache and gratitude. Maybe love doesn't die, she said quietly. Maybe it just waits until we're ready to see it again. They talked late into the night, not about the missing years, but about small things, farming seasons, family names, the places the river had flooded and receded. Every story built a bridge over time, plank by plank. When Helen finally stood to leave, James followed her to the door. The air outside had cooled, and the sky had filled with the pale silver of early stars. He walked her to the truck, and they stood there for a moment without speaking. "Will you come back?" he asked finally. She smiled through her tears. "If you'll have me. I think I'd like that," he said softly. As she drove away, the porch light glowed behind her, a small but steady beacon against the wide night. The road home stretched long and quiet. Yet for the first time in years, Helen felt something new settle inside her, a sense that life had not been finished, only paused. She reached the farmhouse past midnight. The fields were dark, but the stars above seemed brighter than usual. She parked, turned off the engine and sat for a while, hands resting on the steering wheel. The silence around her was deep but gentle. In the morning, she would begin again, writing letters of her own this time, not to the past, but to the family she had found. The attic would stay open now, the chest empty of secrets. The truth had walked out of it and taken its rightful place under the open sky. The morning rose with a softness that felt almost unreal. Mist rolled low over the wheat fields, turning everything pale and quiet. Helen sat by the window of her farmhouse, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The events of the previous evening drifted through her mind in slow motion. James's voice, the way his eyes had softened, the steady calm in his presence that seemed both foreign and familiar. She had spoken the truth at last, and now the world around her felt changed. Not louder or brighter, but somehow more honest. Outside, the first light spread across the land, touching the roof of the barn, the clothesline, the old oak that had stood since her children were small. Everything looked the same, but Helen knew something had shifted in ways that couldn't be seen. She placed the cup down and reached for the photograph that sat beside the lamp. Samuel and the child James stared back from another lifetime. For years, she had believed the world took her son. Now she knew it had only hidden him until both were ready to find each other. She set the photograph carefully on the windowsill, next to a small vase of wildflowers she had picked the week before. Their petals had begun to fade, curling at the edges, but they still held a quiet beauty. Age didn't erase purpose, it only changed the way it showed. Helen rose from her chair, folded her shawl around her shoulders, and began the simple ritual of her day. She washed the dishes, fed the chickens, and swept the floor, not out of routine, but to steady herself. Each familiar motion helped her feel the ground beneath her feet, the weight of the present moment. The world outside her window no longer felt like a cage of loneliness. It felt like a stage waiting for the next act. She decided she wouldn't wait long before seeing James again. There were still so many things unsaid, so many questions about Samuel, about those years she had been made to forget. She wanted to hear how he had lived, what kind of father Samuel had been, what kind of man James had become. She also wanted to tell him things, how faith had carried her when she thought all was lost, how kindness had been her only compass when the world went silent. After breakfast, Helen pulled out her notebook and began to write. The words came slow at first, then easier. "James, I don't know if you'll ever understand what this means to me. I spent a lifetime believing a part of me was gone. Finding you has made every quiet year worth enduring. I don't expect much, just a chance to know you, to listen, to share what time has left for us." She paused, the pen hovering over the page. A thought came to her. She didn't want this new chapter to live in secrecy as the last had. This truth belonged in the light. She folded the letter and sealed it inside an envelope, then glanced toward the phone that hung on the wall. For years, it had been her link to distant family, rare calls from her daughters, messages from church friends checking on her health. That morning, she decided to use it differently. She dialed the number James had written for her before she left the previous night. It rang 3 times before his voice came through, rough but warm. "Hello, James. "It's me, Helen." There was a short pause. "You made it home all right?" "I did," she said. "I was just calling to ask if you'd let me visit again. Maybe this weekend." "I'd like that," he said. The sound of his voice carried something she recognized instantly, a tone of quiet relief. They agreed on Sunday afternoon. The moment she hung up, Helen felt a stillness settle inside her. It wasn't peace exactly, but something close, something like permission to breathe again. The days leading to Sunday passed with a strange kind of anticipation. She spent her mornings tending the garden and her afternoons sorting through old boxes in the living room. It was work she had avoided for years, but now it felt necessary, like clearing a path through overgrown grass. She found photographs of her daughters as children, school certificates, faded postcards from relatives who had long since passed. Beneath one stack of papers, she found a small handkerchief embroidered with the initials SR. Her breath caught. The thread was slightly frayed, the cloth yellowed with time. She held it to her chest for a long moment, then folded it carefully and placed it inside her Bible. There was no more pain in remembering Samuel now, only gratitude. He had carried the truth as long as he could. In the end, even after his death, he had kept his promise. When Sunday came, Helen rose early and dressed in her best clothes, not out of vanity, but respect. She chose a simple navy dress and a grey cardigan, the same one she wore to church on colder mornings. The drive to Boone Hollow felt shorter this time. The sky was clear, the fields full of late summer colour. When she reached the white farmhouse, she saw James standing by the porch, as if waiting for her. He greeted her with a smile, less cautious than before. "You made it," he said. "I told you I would," she replied, stepping from the truck. He led her inside, and she noticed details she hadn't seen on her first visit: the row of books above the fireplace, a quilt draped over the couch, the faint smell of pie cooling in the kitchen. The place felt lived in, steady, a reflection of the man who called it home. "Coffee?" he asked. "Please," she said, smiling. They sat across from each other at the same wooden table where she had told him the truth days earlier. Now, the silence between them was easier, almost companionable. James poured her coffee, then set down a small dish of sugar. "I didn't sleep much that night after you left," he said. "I kept thinking about everything you said, about him, about you. I went through some of his things in the barn. There were boxes I hadn't opened since he passed." Helen leaned forward slightly. "Did you find something?" He nodded. "Letters, not from you, but about you. He wrote to a friend, asking how to reach you, asking if your father was still alive. I guess he never got an answer, but in everyone, he said the same thing, that he hoped you'd find peace." Tears welled in her eyes. "He always believed in peace," she said softly. James took a sip of coffee and looked at her for a long moment. "He also left a note with the letters. Said that if I ever met a woman named Helen Whitmore, I should listen before I judge." Helen smiled faintly. Then he knew this day might come. "I think he hoped for it," James said. They spent the afternoon walking through the fields behind the house. The corn was high, swaying gently in the wind. Helen ran her hand along the rough stalks, feeling the same rhythm she had known her whole life, the heartbeat of the land, steady and forgiving. James told her about his childhood, the long winters, the nights by the fire, when Samuel would tell stories about faith, about waiting for things that took longer than one lifetime to bloom. He spoke about how his father had never remarried, how he had carried a quiet kind of longing that no one dared to name. Helen listened without interrupting. Each word felt like a piece of her own story being returned to her. By late afternoon, they sat on the porch steps watching the light change across the horizon. The world had a way of slowing at that hour, the kind of stillness that invited reflection. "I don't know what to call you," James said after a while. "Helen feels right, but—" She smiled gently. "Then Helen it is. Names don't make family. Love does." He nodded, his expression soft. "You sound like him. Maybe he never stopped speaking through us," she said. The moment hung between them, gentle, complete. For the first time in many years, Helen felt whole. The emptiness she had carried for decades had finally found a place to rest. When she drove home that evening, the air had cooled and the first stars began to appear. The road stretched long ahead, familiar yet new. She didn't feel old that night. She felt seasoned, like the land after rain, worn but alive. Back at the farmhouse, she placed the letters in a box by her bedside. Before turning out the light, she wrote one more note in her notebook under the previous entry. Some truths arrive late, but they still arrive in time. She closed the book, whispered a prayer of thanks, and let the quiet fill the room. The house, once heavy with silence, now breathed again. The wind brushed softly through the open window, carrying the scent of wheat and rain. For the first time in many years, Helen dreamed not of loss, but of the harvest still to come. The week after Helen's second visit passed in slow, thoughtful rhythm. The days were mild, and the late summer air carried that faint coolness that hinted at autumn's approach. She moved through her chores as she always had, feeding chickens, folding linens, dusting shelves, but everything felt different now. The smallest sound seemed sharper, more meaningful. The creak of the back door, the rustle of wheat against the fence, the low murmur of the radio from the kitchen window. Life had not changed its pace, but her heart had. It beat in harmony with something newly restored. Each morning, she woke early and sat at her table, letters spread out before her, like seeds waiting for the right soil. She read them not as echoes of sorrow anymore, but as proof of love's endurance. Every page carried a piece of Samuel's voice, steady and plain, full of gratitude for ordinary blessings. He had written about the boy's first steps, his first words, the first harvest they brought in together. The details were small, yet each one built a world she had missed, but could now imagine with clarity. She no longer saw those missing years as empty. They were full, simply lived elsewhere. Helen began keeping her own journal, recording what she remembered of those years when the truth had been hidden. Not to dwell on pain, but to leave behind something honest. She wrote for her daughters, for the grandchildren who might someday ask about the woman who lived at the edge of the fields. She wanted them to understand that truth could arrive late, but still carry grace. By Friday afternoon, she received a letter of her own. The envelope was new, but the handwriting was careful and familiar. It belonged to James. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside, his words were simple, written in the same plain language his father had used so long ago. Helen, I've been thinking about our talk. There's so much I never knew, but I don't want to lose time trying to piece every gap. You gave me something that had been missing my whole life. I'd like you to meet my family this Sunday. They've heard about you, and they want to meet the woman who raised Faith out of silence. Helen pressed the letter to her chest. She felt the weight of it settle into her heart, like a final piece of a puzzle long unsolved. That Sunday morning, the church bell rang softly in the distance while Helen prepared for the visit. She wore her best dress again, pinned her hair neatly, and tucked a few wildflowers into a small jar. It wasn't a gift, exactly, just a token of gratitude, something alive to bring into a new chapter. The drive to Boone Hollow felt like traveling through a painting she had always loved but never understood. The roads curved gently through green pastures and fields of golden grain. Each mile felt like a prayer whispered under her breath, thanking God for Mercy's patience. When she arrived, the Reed farmhouse looked brighter than before, touched by the kind of sunlight that makes everything appear cleaner, newer. Children's laughter echoed from the yard. Two little girls ran barefoot through the grass, chasing a puppy that darted ahead of them. Their laughter was free and full, the kind that heals old silences without even knowing it. James stepped out from the porch, his face breaking into a smile when he saw her. "They've been waiting," he said. "My wife made lunch. The girls helped, so you've been warned." Helen laughed softly, the sound surprising her. "Then it'll be perfect," she said. Inside, the air smelled of baked bread and cinnamon. James's wife, a gentle woman named Clara, greeted her warmly and guided her to the table. There was no awkwardness, no hesitation, only kindness. The girls sat on either side of her, curious but polite, whispering questions that made Clara smile. "So you're Grandpa Samuel's friend?" one asked. Helen smiled and nodded. "Something like that." They ate, talked, and shared stories that wove together decades of separate lives. James spoke of his farm, his children, and the years he'd worked to keep the land alive after Samuel passed. Clara shared stories of community gatherings, of hard winters and faithful summers. Helen listened with her full heart, her eyes often drifting to the photographs hanging on the wall, family portraits, harvest scenes, children's school pictures. Samuel's photo rested among them. It felt right, like his presence had been waiting for her to see it there. After lunch, James led her to the barn. Inside, the smell of hay and old timber filled the air. Dust motes drifted lazily through beams of sunlight that broke through the cracks. He walked to the back and opened a small wooden chest. "I found this when I was looking through his things," he said. "I think it's meant for you." Inside was a small Bible, its leather cover cracked with age. On the first page, Samuel had written in neat script, "To Helen, some truths cannot be buried by silence. Love is one of them." Beneath the inscription was a pressed flower, worn and fragile, but still holding its color. Helen traced the words with her fingertips, tears rising quietly. She couldn't speak. The world around her faded until only the sound of her heartbeat remained. James stood beside her, silent, letting her have the moment. After a while, she closed the Bible and held it to her chest. "He kept faith," she whispered. "He did," James said, "and now I see why." They walked back toward the house together. The children were sitting on the steps, building towers from smooth stones. The sight of them made Helen smile through her tears. The cycle had come full. What had once been hidden was now living openly in sunlight. That evening, Helen stayed for supper. They ate outside under the wide Missouri sky, the air warm and filled with the smell of grass and wood smoke. Fireflies began to appear, tiny lanterns blinking across the yard. As the children chased them with jars, James leaned back in his chair, watching them. "Funny thing," he said. "When I was young, I used to ask my father if he ever regretted anything. He'd always say no, said every path has its reason. I never really understood what he meant until now." Helen nodded, her gaze following the children's laughter. "Sometimes love doesn't reach us the way we expect, but it reaches us all the same." He smiled. "You believe everything happens for a reason. I believe grace finds its way, even through broken roads," she said. The sky darkened slowly, stars taking their places one by one. The moment felt suspended, like a photograph she would carry in her memory forever, a table surrounded by light, laughter, and the soft hum of peace settling over a long story finally told. When it was time to leave, James walked her to the truck. "You don't have to drive all the way back tonight," he said. "We've got a guest room." Helen smiled, touched by the offer. "Not this time, but maybe next Sunday." He nodded, knowing she meant it. As she started the engine, he stepped back, his hand raised in quiet farewell. The headlights cast a soft glow across the driveway, catching the edges of his figure as he stood in the doorway. The road home was quiet. The night stretched wide, filled with stars and the scent of the harvest beginning to turn. Helen drove slowly, her hand steady on the wheel. Her heart felt light, but not empty, like a field finally cleared and ready for new growth. When she reached her farmhouse, she parked and left the engine running for a moment, listening to the familiar hum of its idle rhythm. Then she shut it off, stepped out, and looked up at the sky. It was the same sky that had hung above her when she was a girl, when Samuel had gone to war, when she'd become a wife, a mother, a widow. It had watched over her through silence and revelation alike. Inside, the house welcomed her with quiet warmth. She placed Samuel's Bible on the mantel beside the framed photograph of the two of them. She didn't need to hide it. Nothing in her life needed hiding anymore. Before going to bed, she wrote one more line in her journal. "Today I met Grace face to face, and it looked like family." The wind outside moved softly through the trees, carrying with it the faint sound of crickets and the rustle of leaves. Helen closed her eyes and let sleep come, not as an escape, but as a promise that tomorrow would be gentle. And in that peace, the house settled into silence, one no longer heavy, but whole. The following morning began with a light fog that wrapped around the valley like a quiet blanket. Helen awoke before sunrise, her thoughts already alive with the memory of yesterday's visit. The house was still, and the soft creak of the wooden floor followed her steps as she moved toward the kitchen. She didn't turn on the lamp right away. The grey dawn filtering through the window was enough. For years, her mornings days had begun in silence, but this silence was different. It didn't feel lonely anymore. It felt full. Every corner of the house seemed to breathe again, as if the walls themselves had exhaled after holding their breath for too long. The truth had been spoken, and the air was lighter for it. She set a kettle on the stove and watched as the thin ribbon of steam began to rise. Outside, the first light of morning touched the tops of the trees, and the faint cry of a bird echoed through the fields. The world looked familiar, yet she no longer stood in it as the same woman. She was still Helen Whitmore, the widow, the mother, the keeper of the farmhouse. But she was also something more now, someone with her story made whole again. The years had taken much, but they hadn't taken everything. What had been hidden had found its way back into her hands, and what was broken had begun to mend. After breakfast, she opened the front door and stepped out into the fresh air. The dew on the grass sparkled faintly in the growing light. She walked slowly toward the edge of the yard, where the fields began. The ground was cool beneath her shoes, and the air carried the clean scent of earth. From that spot, she could see the road stretching far into the distance, the same road that had led her to Boone Hollow and to the son she never knew she had. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the quiet wash over her. For the first time in many years, she prayed not for understanding or for strength, but for gratitude. She thanked God for second chances, for the kind of truth that doesn't destroy but rebuilds. As the sun rose higher, she returned to the house and began to tidy up the parlor. Dust had gathered on the bookshelves, and she took her time wiping each surface, moving slowly, almost ceremoniously. Every object carried a memory. The clock that had once marked her children's bedtime, the lamp Samuel had given her before he went away to war, the framed picture of Walter sitting beside the barn with a straw hat in his hands. Her life had been full of love, just not the kind that stayed in one shape. Some love had been built on routine and trust, the quiet companionship of marriage. Some had been stolen by silence and buried under fear. And now, at last, one love had returned through the face of a man who called her by name with the same calm tone Samuel once used when saying goodbye. Helen spent the morning writing in her journal again. Her handwriting was careful but firm, each letter carrying the steadiness of her heart. She wrote about the first time she had met Samuel as a young girl outside the church fair, about the way he used to laugh easily, about the small wooden cross he had carved for her before leaving for the war. She wrote about her father's sternness, about her marriage to Walter, about the day the doctor had whispered that her child hadn't survived. Each line was an act of release, a way to hand the truth back to time so it could rest properly. She didn't write with bitterness. She wrote with understanding. It wasn't about blame anymore. It was about giving everything its rightful place in the story. When the clock struck noon, she put down her pen and stared at the page for a long time. The sunlight through the curtains formed a bright stripe across the table, and dust danced in its glow. She thought of James again. His quiet manner, the way he listened without interrupting, the slight smile that softened his face when he spoke about the land. There was so much of Samuel in him that it hurt and healed at the same time. But there was also something of her there, something strong and calm. That thought brought a warmth she hadn't felt in years. Later that afternoon, Helen went into town for supplies. She parked by the general store, where the same bell still chimed over the door when she entered. The owner, an older woman named Edith, greeted her with a smile. "Haven't seen you much lately," she said. "Everything all right at the farm?" Helen returned the smile. "Everything's just fine," she said. "Better than fine, actually." She chose her words with care, not wanting to reveal too much, but unwilling to hide the light that had found her again. Edith tilted her head with curiosity. "Well, that's good to hear. You've always kept that place so well. The Lord must be looking after you." Helen nodded. "He always has. I just didn't always notice." They talked a bit longer, about the weather, about the church repairs, about the new family that had moved into the old Patterson house. Ordinary conversation, but Helen heard it differently now. There was life in small talk, life in the rhythm of everyday kindness. It reminded her that the world keeps moving whether we're watching or not, and that every heart carries its own hidden story. On the drive home, she stopped by the small cemetery outside town. She hadn't planned to, but the turn came naturally. The path was lined with low stones and wildflowers that had grown between them. She walked slowly, her hands clasped before her, until she reached Walter's grave. She knelt and brushed away the leaves that had gathered around the base. "You gave me a good life," she said quietly, "and I hope I gave you one too." The words came out calm, not heavy. There was no guilt in her voice, only truth. She had loved him faithfully. Now she understood that love can take more than one form without cancelling the other. She stood and looked toward the far corner of the cemetery where her parents rested. For a long moment, she simply stared, the wind moving softly through the trees. "You thought you were protecting me," she whispered. "Maybe in your own way you were. But time has a way of undoing what fear builds. I found what you hid, and I forgive you." The words floated into the open air, and something within her seemed to ease. Forgiveness wasn't a feeling that burst into existence. It was a slow unwinding, a loosening of the knots that kept her tied to sorrow. She turned back toward her truck, the weight in her chest lighter than it had been in years. When she reached home, the sky was turning gold. The air smelled of hay and distant smoke from neighboring farms. She walked into the kitchen, set her groceries down, and lit the lamp on the table. The letters were still there, stacked neatly in the same order. She untied the ribbon and read one more before dinner. Samuel had written it near the end of his life, and the handwriting trembled slightly. "If the Lord gives me time, I'll see her again. If not in this world, then in the one where all secrets come to rest. I've kept her name alive in my prayers. I've taught our boy what kindness looks like, and if he ever meets her, I hope he'll recognize her by the way she forgives." Helen set the letter down and wept softly, not from pain, but from the tenderness of those words. Samuel had known forgiveness would be the bridge that joined them all again. That night, she lit a candle and sat by the window. The fields outside glowed faintly under the moon, a silver shimmer rolling over the land. Somewhere beyond those fields, her son and his family were probably finishing supper, maybe reading stories to the children before bed. The thought filled her heart with a peace that felt like prayer itself. She whispered into the quiet, "I'll see you soon, James." Then she blew out the candle, and the house settled into a stillness that felt alive rather than empty. The shadows that once frightened her now seemed to belong. They were part of the whole picture, light and dark, loss and finding, silence and song. In her sleep, she dreamed of walking through a field of wheat that swayed higher than her shoulders. The wind carried a low hum, the same tune Samuel had once whistled while working. Ahead of her stood a figure with grey hair and a calm smile, holding the hand of a boy with familiar eyes. They didn't speak, they simply waited until she reached them. Then as the wind passed gently around them, they turned and began to walk toward the horizon together. The sky above them glowed with soft gold, and the air was filled with the quiet strength of forgiveness. When Helen woke, the morning light poured through the window like a blessing. She sat up slowly and looked around her room. Nothing had changed, yet everything felt new. The house wasn't just a place she lived in anymore. It was a place that had seen truth come home. She got out of bed, straightened her quilt and smiled to herself. Life wasn't finished with her yet. The following week unfolded like a slow hymn, steady, patient, each day carrying its own verse of quiet discovery. The air had changed. Summer was giving its last warm sighs, and the trees had begun to turn just slightly along the edges, their leaves brushing gold into the green. Helen noticed these things more than she used to. Maybe it was because her heart had finally grown still enough to listen again. She woke before sunrise each morning and sat by the window, watching the fog drift through the valley like a slow-moving river. The silence was not empty anymore. It was sacred. Every sound, every scent, the whistle of the kettle, the hum of cicadas at dusk, the smell of rain on dust, felt like a piece of life she was meant to notice now that her story had come full circle. One morning, as she sipped her coffee, a thought came to her that she couldn't shake. The letters she had found in the attic had given her peace, but they also held a story that didn't belong to her alone. Those letters weren't just hers, they were history, testimony, the kind of truth that could teach others about endurance, forgiveness, and the quiet way love survives even the cruelty of time. She decided then that they should be preserved properly, not tucked away in a drawer or kept for her children to stumble upon someday. She wanted them to live, to speak, to outlast her. After breakfast, she pulled her shawl tight and drove into town. The road was familiar, the same fences, the same turns, but every journey now felt purposeful, like a string tying her present to her past. At the county library, the bell above the door rang softly as she entered. The place smelled of old paper and polished floors. Behind the counter sat a woman in her 40s, kind-eyed and welcoming. Her name tag read, Marianne. "Good morning," Helen said, her voice calm but filled with intent. "I have some letters that might belong here." Marianne tilted her head with curiosity. "Letters?" "Yes," Helen replied, placing the box on the counter. "They're over 50 years old. My husband, well, the man who wrote them was a soldier, and the letters tell his story. But they also tell mine." The librarian smiled gently. "Would you like them archived? We keep historical collections from the county, war correspondence, family journals, things like that. You'd be surprised how much those pieces mean to people years later." Helen nodded. "That's what I want. I just don't want them to disappear again." They went through the contents together, and for nearly an hour Helen explained the history, the attic, the hidden trunk, the discovery, the truth that had waited half a lifetime to surface. Marianne listened without interrupting, her expression softening as she realized this wasn't just a contribution to the archives, it was an act of closure. When they finished, she said quietly, "I'll make sure they're treated with care. These letters will tell people what real faith looks like." Helen left the library lighter than she had arrived. The box no longer weighed her down. It had done its work, and now it would live on beyond her hands. As she stepped out into the sunlight, a breeze moved across the square, lifting the edge of her scarf. She paused for a moment, looking up at the clock tower and the steady sky above it. The years no longer frightened her. They were not lost. They were simply stored in time's own keeping. That afternoon, she stopped by the church. The wooden door creaked as she entered, the scent of wax and cedar heavy in the air. The pews were empty, the altar bathed in a soft glow from the stained glass windows. She walked slowly to the front and sat in the same spot she had sat in as a girl, as a wife, as a mother, and now, finally, as a woman at peace. The silence of the sanctuary wrapped around her, and she bowed her head. "Thank you," she whispered, "for the truth that waited, for the love that lasted, for the years that taught me how to forgive." Her words echoed softly, then faded into the stillness. When she looked up, the light through the stained glass painted the floor in bands of red and gold, and for a fleeting second she felt as though Samuel was there beside her, smiling, not as the man who left, but as the man who had never truly gone. The following Sunday, James visited her at the farmhouse. He arrived with a basket of apples from his orchard and a newspaper tucked under his arm. When she opened the door, his face lit with that same gentle calm that had once belonged to Samuel. They sat together in the kitchen, where the air was warm and smelled faintly of cinnamon and coffee. The radio played softly in the background, a hymn from the local station, slow and full of memory. "I stopped by the library," he said after a while. "Marianne told me about the letters, said she'd never seen anything like them." Helen smiled. "They were meant to be found, not hidden again. I just wish I'd had the courage to look sooner." James shook his head. Maybe this was the right time. Some truths wouldn't make sense until the heart is ready for them. She nodded, her eyes soft with thought. "You sound like your father." He chuckled quietly. "That's what Clara says too." They spent the rest of the morning talking about the harvest, about his children, about the small joys that had become her favorite kind of conversation. When the clock struck noon, she asked if he would help her in the garden. Together, they pruned the overgrown rose bushes near the porch. The work was slow and pleasant, and they laughed easily, the way families do when words are less important than presence. At one point, Helen stopped to rest, her hand pressed against her back. James took the clippers from her and said, "You've done enough. Let me finish." She smiled, watching him move with with the same steady patience Samuel once had. Seeing him there among the roses filled her with something deeper than pride. It was the quiet realization that her life, though marked by loss, had not ended in sorrow. It had bloomed again, late but full, like the roses themselves. As evening drew near, they sat on the porch with glasses of lemonade. The light slanted across the fields, long and gold. The air was cool and smelled faintly of hickory smoke from a distant farm. Helen turned to him and said, "I've been thinking of writing down the story, not for the world, but for your children and mine. They deserve to know what silence cost and what love gave back." James nodded. "You should. They'll learn that truth can wait, but it never dies." She looked out over the horizon, where the land met the wide blue sky. "I want them to know that forgiveness isn't weakness," she said. "It's the strongest kind of courage there is." The sun dipped lower, and for a long while neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The wind carried the language they both understood, the rhythm of peace, the soft hum of fields at rest. Later that night, after James had left, Helen returned to her writing desk. The candle beside her burned steady, its light dancing on the pages. She began to write, not just about Samuel and the letters, but about everything that had shaped her, the lessons learned in silence, the love that waited through years, the discovery that no life is wasted when it's lived with faith. Her handwriting flowed more easily now, the lines longer, fuller, sure. She wrote until the flame burned low and her hand grew tired. When she finished, she read the last line aloud. What was lost was never gone. It was simply waiting for light. She smiled and closed the notebook. For the first time, she felt ready not only to remember, but to rest. She blew out the candle and looked through the window. The moon hung full over the fields, silver light spreading across the wheat like water. The farmhouse stood strong, quiet, eternal, a witness to decades of waiting and revelation. Somewhere far off, she imagined Samuel walking the edge of heaven's horizon, smiling the way he used to when the day's work was done. And down below, on the land they both once called home, their son and his family carried the story forward, not in words, but in living proof that time could wound and still make room for grace. Helen turned from the window, whispering to herself, "Nothing truly good is ever lost." Then she lay down and let the night wrap around her like a prayer finally answered. The days that followed were gentle in their unfolding, the kind of days that carried no drama, yet seemed to whisper meaning with every passing hour. Morning light slid slowly across the wooden floorboards, and Helen would rise before it reached her bedroom wall. She no longer hurried through her routine. There was peace in every movement, tying her apron, lighting the stove, feeding the chickens, watching the thin trail of smoke rise through the still air. Her life had become quieter but fuller, as though the world had widened instead of shrinking. Her thoughts often returned to Boone Hollow, to the small white farmhouse with its broad porch and fields that rolled into the distance. She thought of James, of Clara, and of the little girls with bright eyes who had already begun to send her small drawings in the mail. Each envelope that arrived carried a piece of joy with it, a stick figure of Grandma Helen, a flower colored in blue crayon, a clumsy heart drawn with love. She kept them neatly pinned above her desk, a wall of simple proof that healing had reached beyond her own heart and settled into the hearts of others. That autumn, the county prepared for its annual harvest festival. It was a tradition older than most of the people who attended, a day when farmers brought baskets of produce and families gathered to share food, laughter, and prayer. Helen hadn't gone in years. She had always found it difficult, the chatter of families, the sight of generations together. But this year felt different. This year she wanted to go, not as an outsider watching others live, but as someone whose life had finally rejoined the flow of time. On the morning of the festival, she ironed her best dress and wore the simple silver brooch that had once belonged to her mother. The weather was kind, neither too warm nor too cool, and the road shimmered faintly under the sunlight as she drove toward town. She parked near the square where the smell of baked bread and roasted corn filled the air. People greeted her with smiles and polite warmth, faces she had known for decades, kids, neighbors who had watched her raise children, who had watched her grow older. She moved among them with calm assurance, no longer burdened by the invisible weight of secrets. Near the church booth, she spotted a familiar face, Marianne, the librarian, arranging a small table with historical displays. "Helen," she called, waving, "come look at this." On the table were several photographs, newspaper clippings, and a glass case containing a few old letters. Helen stepped closer, her heart catching as she recognized the careful handwriting inside. "These are from your collection," Marianne said. "We displayed them this week as part of the county's history exhibit. People have been reading them all morning." Helen stared at the letters for a long moment. The words she had once read in the solitude of her attic now sat beneath glass for the world to see, no longer hidden or forgotten. It should have felt strange, but instead it filled her with quiet pride. "They belonged to the world long before they belonged to me," she said softly. Marianne smiled. "They've touched a lot of hearts already. Some of the older veterans have stopped by to read them. One man told me they reminded him of his own wife." Helen nodded, emotion tightening her throat. "Then they're where they're meant to be." As the afternoon stretched on, music began to rise from the bandstand, a fiddle, a banjo, the rhythmic clap of hands. Children ran through the square with ribbons and balloons, and the smell of pie drifted through the breeze. Helen sat on a bench near the fountain, watching it all. For the first time in many years, she didn't feel apart from the world. She felt within it. Every sound, every color, every laugh seemed connected to her, as if the world itself was whispering, "You're still here. You still matter." After a while, she heard a familiar voice behind her. "I thought I might find you here." She turned to see James standing with Clara and the girls. He was holding a basket of apples, and the younger child waved excitedly when she saw her. "Grandma Helen!" she shouted, running into her arms. Helen laughed, lifting her slightly, the warmth of the small body against her chest filling her with a kind of joy that didn't need words. James sat beside her on the bench, his expression easy. "They wouldn't come without bringing you something," he said, setting the basket on her lap. "Clara made apple butter this morning." Helen smiled. "You spoil me." "Not nearly enough," Clara said kindly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You've given this family more than you know." Aye, they spent the afternoon together, moving among the stalls, sharing stories, tasting pies that were too sweet but perfect for the occasion. Neighbors who had known Helen all her life looked at her curiously when they saw her with James, some whispering questions quietly among themselves. She didn't mind, let them wonder. The truth was hers to hold, and it no longer needed defending. As the sun began to lower, painting the sky in amber and rose, the festival's pastor stepped up to the microphone to give a short prayer of thanks. His voice carried gently through the square. "For the land that sustains us," he said, "for the families that hold us, and for the grace that forgives what time tried to take away." Helen bowed her head, her eyes closing as the words settled deep. She thought of Samuel, of the letters, of the long road that had led her here. She thought of the attic and the dust and the silence, and how out of that silence a new voice had been born, the voice of truth, speaking softly but steadily. When she opened her eyes again, she saw James looking at her with quiet understanding. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The look between them said everything, that the story that had begun in secrecy had ended in light. After the festival, James and his family walked her back to her truck. The sky above them was deep blue now, the first stars beginning to shine. The girls climbed into the back seat for a moment to say goodbye, wrapping their arms around her neck. "Come visit us again soon," the older one said earnestly. "I will," Helen promised, kissing her cheek. "And next time, I'll bring pie." James smiled. "That's a deal." She drove home in the cool evening air, the road dimly lit by the rising moon. The headlights stretched far ahead, guiding her through the familiar turns. She felt a soft tiredness, not of age but of peace, a deep, full exhaustion that comes after years of carrying a burden that has finally been set down. Back at the farmhouse, she parked the truck and stood for a long time before going inside. The fields were silent, the sky alive with stars. A soft wind moved through the wheat, and she thought of all the hands that had worked this land, hers, Walter's, Samuel's, James's, and realized that their lives had been threads of the same cloth all along. Each of them had planted something that another would one day harvest. Inside, she placed the basket of apples on the table and lit a single lamp. The house glowed softly, golden and calm. She walked to the mantel, where the Bible Samuel had left her, sat beside his photograph. For a moment she rested her hand on it, feeling the cool surface under her palm. "It's all right now," she whispered. "Everything's as it should be." She didn't expect an answer, but in the quiet that followed, the old clock in the hallway began to chime. Its sound rolled gently through the house, not as an interruption, but as an affirmation, a reminder that time keeps moving, but it doesn't erase. It carries forward what matters. It redeems what was once lost. Helen turned down the lamp and made her way to bed. Outside, the wind had softened to a hush, and the faint glow of the moon touched the curtains. She lay still, her heart calm, her thoughts clear. Tomorrow would come with its small tasks and quiet joys, and when it did, she would meet it not as a woman marked by loss, but as one who had lived long enough to see that love, no matter how long delayed, never truly disappears. It only waits for the right light to be seen again. The first frost of autumn arrived quietly, like a visitor who didn't want to be noticed. Helen awoke to find the fields glistening beneath a thin coat of white, the air crisp and still. She stood by the window wrapped in her shawl, watching the world shimmer under the early light. For years she had dreaded this season. The shortening days and the chill in the air had always made the house feel lonelier, the silence heavier. But this year, the frost didn't carry sorrow. It carried grace. It was a reminder that everything on earth rests before it blooms again. She went about her morning tasks, steady and unhurried. The kettle hissed softly, and the familiar scent of tea filled the room. On the wall, the clock ticked with its calm rhythm, marking another ordinary day in a life that had stopped feeling ordinary. As she sipped her tea, her eyes rested on the basket of apples James had brought. She smiled faintly, remembering the laughter at the festival, the warmth of the children's hands in hers, and the way the light had caught on their faces as they ran through the square. It had been so long since she had felt surrounded by family, by life in motion. That memory alone was enough to keep her heart warm against the cold. Later that morning, she wrapped herself in her coat and stepped outside. The frost crunched beneath her shoes as she walked toward the barn. Inside, the air smelled faintly of hay and cedar, and sunlight poured through the cracks in the boards, striping the floor with gold. She paused there, breathing in the quiet, and for a moment she could almost hear Samuel humming the way he used to when working. She didn't try to fight the tears that came. They weren't heavy anymore, just part of the way memory breathes. As she reached for a rake, leaning against the wall, she noticed something she hadn't before, a small tin box tucked behind a beam near the back of the barn. The sight made her pause. She pulled it out carefully, the dust coating her fingers. Inside was a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age, and a photograph of a much younger Samuel, standing in the same barn, the same light slanting across his shoulders. She unfolded the paper slowly, her hands trembling, and saw his handwriting once again. If these words are ever found, it means the Lord has seen fit to let truth live on longer than fear. I've hidden this, not to conceal, but to preserve. I want whoever finds it to remember that forgiveness is stronger than pride. I made choices I cannot undo, but I pray love will find its way through the cracks of what I broke. Helen closed her eyes, holding the letter to her heart. Even after all this time, Samuel's voice had found another path to reach her. It felt as if the world itself was determined to make sure that no word of his would remain buried. She folded the paper again, placed it inside the small Bible he had given her, and whispered, "It already has." That evening, James called. His voice carried warmth through the line, the kind of tone people use when they're not calling out of obligation, but out of simple affection. "Clara's making stew tomorrow," he said. "The girls keep asking if you'll come. They've been practicing a song from church they want to show you." Helen smiled. "Then I wouldn't miss it." "Good," he said. "Bring that pie you promised." "I'll bring two," she answered. The next day, the drive to Boone Hollow seemed shorter than ever. The trees along the road had turned fully now, their branches alive with deep reds and amber gold. When she arrived, Clara greeted her with a warm hug, and the girls ran out from the porch singing off-key, their voices bright and free. Helen laughed until her eyes watered. For a woman who had once believed her days of joy were behind her, it felt almost miraculous to discover that life could begin again so late. The afternoon passed easily, full of laughter, stories, and the comfort of family. They ate together, and afterward James led her outside to the porch while the children played. The fields stretched wide before them, the sun low in the sky. He turned to her and said, "I've been thinking, Helen. The farm has more land than I can manage. I was wondering if you'd like a small piece of it, something you could make your own again." She looked at him, surprised. "Oh, James, that's too much." "It's not," he said simply. "It's a gift, not out of debt, but out of gratitude. You gave me back more than I can ever repay." Helen was quiet for a long moment, the wind brushing softly against her hair. "Then I'll accept it," she said at last, "but only if we tend it together. I've had enough of living apart from what matters," he smiled. "That's a promise." Over the next few weeks, they worked side by side, clearing the small plot of land behind his barn. The soil was rich, dark, and soft from recent rain. Helen decided she would plant flowers there, bright ones that would bloom through summer and return each spring, just as the truth had returned to her. She named it Grace's Garden, though she never told anyone why. To her, it was a place to lay down sorrow and let beauty rise in its place. Each morning she arrived early, the dew still fresh on the grass, her hands steady on the handle of the trowel. James would bring her coffee, and they would work quietly, talking only when words were needed. The rhythm of it soothed her, and with every seed she pressed into the earth, she felt as though she was burying the remnants of the past in exchange for peace. One afternoon, Clara joined them with the children. The girls ran through the rows, their laughter floating through the air, and Helen found herself thinking that this was what heaven might feel like, not distant, but near, in moments like these, when life felt simple and whole. She looked up at James and said, "You've built something good here." He smiled. "We both did." That night, when Helen returned home, she sat by her writing desk again. The lamplight flickered gently as she opened her journal. She wrote about the garden, about the laughter, about how life had a way of turning pain into soil where new things could grow. Her words flowed without hesitation now, her sentences long and full, each one carrying the sound of contentment. "It isn't about finding what we lost," she wrote. "It's about understanding that some losses make room for miracles we never expected. I used to think silence was punishment, but now I see it was preparation. The heart needed time to soften before it could hear truth without breaking." When she set her pen down, she felt an unshakable peace. The years that had once seemed wasted now felt redeemed. Everything, every sorrow, every delay, every unanswered prayer had led to this quiet wholeness. Outside, the moonlight touched the fields with silver. The frost was coming again, and soon the flowers she had planted would sleep beneath the earth. But that didn't trouble her. She understood now that rest was part of the cycle, that even in stillness, life was waiting beneath the surface. Helen closed her journal, placed her glasses beside it, and whispered into the silence, "Thank you for giving me back my time." Then she turned off the lamp, letting the soft glow of the moon guide her to bed. As she lay down, she thought of Samuel's words, of James's kindness, of the laughter of children in a field of flowers. She thought of all the ways truth had found her, through dust, through paper, through grace, and as sleep carried her away, one thought remained clear in her heart, that love never ends. It only changes its shape until we are ready to see it again. Winter came early that year. The sky settled into a steady grey, and the wind carried a thin, cold sharpness that slipped through every crack in the farmhouse. Helen prepared as she always did, stacking firewood by the door, sealing the windows with cloth, and filling jars with preserves she had canned in the autumn. But this winter felt different from the others she had endured. It wasn't something to survive anymore. It was something to live through. The house that had once been filled with silence now held the hum of life again. Letters arrived weekly from James and Clara, sometimes with photographs of the girls playing in the snow, sometimes with small notes written in careful, childish handwriting. She pinned each one to the wall near her desk, and every time she looked at them, her heart filled with a quiet gratitude that no words could describe. Her days followed an easy rhythm. She rose with the light, fed the animals, tended the fire, and wrote. The journal she had started months before had become a collection of memories, some sharp with pain, others soft with grace. It was her way of leaving behind a map for whoever might one day wonder what her life had been about. In its pages, she told the truth plainly, without bitterness or embellishment. She wrote about love that had been lost and found, about silence that had turned into understanding, and about the kind of forgiveness that asks for nothing in return. Each evening after supper, she would sit in her chair by the fire and read one of Samuel's old letters. Though she had read them countless times, she always found something new hidden between the lines, a word, a tone, a tenderness she hadn't noticed before. The paper was fragile now, its edges curling, but his voice still felt alive in the ink. One night, as the fire crackled low, she read a line that made her pause. "I believe God lets love circle back, even when we think it's gone. We just have to live long enough to see how." Helen closed the letter and smiled. She whispered, "You were right." Then she leaned back and let the firelight flicker across the room, her thoughts drifting toward the fields beyond the window. The land was resting now, waiting under the frost, and she understood it in a way she hadn't before. Rest wasn't the end. It was part of the cycle, the stillness before renewal. A week before Christmas, James came by with the girls. The truck pulled up just as Helen was sweeping snow from the porch. The air was crisp, and her breath rose in small white clouds. When she saw them, her face brightened. "Well, if it isn't my favorite surprise," she said, brushing her hands on her coat. James grinned. "You didn't think we'd let you spend the holidays alone, did you?" "I was planning on inviting myself anyway," she teased. They brought food, gifts, and laughter. The house filled with sounds it hadn't known in years. Children's voices, the clatter of dishes, the scent of cinnamon and pine. That night after supper, they sat by the fire, the girls on the floor playing with a puzzle, while James and Clara talked quietly with Helen. The conversation drifted from stories of the past to hopes for the future. At one point, Clara looked at Helen and said softly, "I hope when I'm your age, I carry peace the way you do." Helen smiled, her eyes warm. "Peace doesn't come all at once. It comes piece by piece. Every time you forgive, every time you choose kindness when you could choose anger, you build it without realizing. One day you look back, and it's there." The next morning, they took her to church for the Christmas service. The small chapel was packed, the air filled with the sound of the choir and the faint sweetness of candle wax. Helen sat between James and Clara, her hands resting in her lap. As the congregation began to sing Silent Night, she felt tears fill her eyes, not of sadness, but of gratitude. The years had taken much, but they had given her something far more valuable in return: understanding. After the service, the pastor greeted her warmly. "It's good to see you here again, Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "It's been too long." "It's good to be back," she replied with a smile. "The Lord took his time with me, but he didn't forget." He nodded gently. "He never does." When they returned to the farmhouse, the girls helped her light a small Christmas tree she had decorated with ribbons and old ornaments she'd kept through the years. Beneath it, she placed a small wooden box wrapped in brown paper. She had written a note on the top, "For the Reeds, to keep the story alive." Inside were copies of Samuel's letters, her journal, and a photograph of the three of them, Samuel, James, and herself, stitched together by fate and forgiveness. James looked at her curiously as she handed it to him. "What's this?" "A gift," she said, "but not for now, for when the girls are older. One day they'll want to know how their family found its way through time. This will tell them. He turned the box in his hands, his eyes glistening. You've given us more than we could ever repay. Helen smiled softly. Then just live kindly. That's payment enough. They stayed until dusk, when the sky turned the color of soft ash and the first stars appeared. When it was time to go, the girls hugged her tight, promising to visit again soon. After the truck disappeared down the road, Helen stood on the porch a long while, the snow falling gently around her. The world was hushed, the only sound the faint creak of the trees and the steady beat of her heart. That night, she sat once more by the fire, the glow wrapping the room in a gentle warmth. She opened her Bible to the page where Samuel's note was written and read it again. Some truths cannot be buried by silence. Love is one of them. She traced the words with her fingers and whispered, "You were right, my dear. Love doesn't die. It just waits to be remembered." The next morning, she rose early as she always did. She opened the curtains to find the fields covered in white, untouched and pure. The rising sun turned the snow into silver. She stood there for a long time, her hand resting lightly on the window frame, feeling the warmth of the light against the glass. It reminded her of something Samuel once said, that grace isn't loud, it's quiet, like sunlight on frost. She turned from the window and began her day. Her steps were slower now, her body weaker, but her spirit steady. The years had taught her that strength doesn't come from what you can carry, it comes from what you can let go of. As she sat at her table with her cup of tea, she began writing again, her handwriting a little shakier now, but still beautiful in its care. If these words outlive me, let them remind whoever reads them that truth is worth waiting for. I found my peace not in answers, but in the people who came back into my life when I thought all was lost. Love doesn't vanish. It circles back when the heart is ready. When she finished, she placed the paper inside her journal and closed it gently. She didn't know how much time she had left, but she knew she had already been given more than enough. That evening, as she watched the sunset fade into blue, she felt a stillness settle inside her, one that asked for nothing more from the world. The house was warm, the fire steady, the sky vast and kind. She whispered softly, "Everything I prayed for came true, just not when I expected." And with that, she smiled, letting the quiet hold her. Time had stopped being her enemy. It had become her keeper, her teacher, her final companion. Winter stretched long across the valley, but Helen didn't mind its quiet weight. The snow came and went, falling thick on some mornings, melting into soft grey puddles by noon. Life continued in its slow rhythm, the ticking of the old clock, the soft creak of the porch, the wind pressing gently against the shutters. Each sound felt familiar and kind, as if the house itself had learned to breathe in peace. Helen moved through the days with the calm of someone who had already reached the farthest shore of her story, and now simply watched the light change on the water. The visits from James and his family continued through the winter. They came every Sunday, bringing soup, laughter, and the kind of conversation that needed no effort. Sometimes they stayed late, their voices filling the kitchen until the fire burned low. The girls would fall asleep, curled up on the couch, while Clara washed dishes and James helped stack wood by the door. Helen loved those evenings, the sense of belonging, the quiet joy of being needed, the warmth that reached places inside her that had been cold for too long. She no longer counted her days by the clock or the calendar, she counted them by grace. One morning in early February, she woke before dawn. The world outside her window was silver and still, the first light of day barely touching the snow. She sat on the edge of the bed for a while, listening to the silence. Her body ached more than usual, and her hands felt heavy. She reached for her robe, wrapping it tight, and walked slowly toward the kitchen. The kettle was already filled with water. She had prepared it the night before. She lit the stove, the flame flickering softly in the dim light. As she waited for it to boil, she opened her Bible and read the note Samuel had written inside. Some truths cannot be buried by silence. Love is one of them. She smiled faintly. Her breath fogged the window as she looked outside. The world looked clean, untouched. Somewhere out there, beyond the trees and fields, she knew James would be waking soon, Clara making breakfast, the girls laughing as they tried to dress for school. That thought warmed her. Her story had continued through them. It would keep going long after she was gone. After breakfast, she sat at her writing desk. Her movements were slower now, her breathing a little shorter, but her mind clear and steady. She took her pen and wrote on a new page in her journal, "If someone finds these words after I'm gone, let them know that every life, no matter how small it seems, touches another. I thought I had lost everything, but I was wrong. The Lord was only waiting for me to be still enough to see what had always been there. To my children, to my son, to the ones who carry my story, live kindly, keep faith, forgive easily. That's how you find peace." She set the pen down, folded her hands, and looked toward the window again. The sun was rising now, gold spilling across the snow. She could feel its warmth even through the glass. It reminded her of the day she first opened that old trunk in the attic, the day truth came back to her through dust and paper and time. It seemed like another lifetime, but also like yesterday. She thought of that younger version of herself, tired, lonely, unaware that love was waiting in a box above her head. She wished she could tell that woman what she knew now, that patience is its own form of courage, that forgiveness doesn't change the past, but it can heal what the past left behind. When the kettle began to whistle, she rose and turned off the flame. She poured the hot water into her cup, her hands trembling slightly as she set it down. The warmth spread through her palms and up her arms. She took a slow sip, savoring it. The taste of the tea, the soft hum of the wind outside, the faint scent of pine, all of it felt sharper, clearer, as if the world was showing her every detail one more time. Later that morning, James arrived unannounced, a habit he had developed whenever the weather allowed. He knocked softly, and when she didn't answer right away, he let himself in. "Helen," he called, "you up?" He found her by the window, sitting in her chair, the Bible open on her lap. Her face was calm, her eyes closed, the faintest smile on her lips. The morning light fell across her like a blessing. For a long moment, he stood there in silence, understanding without needing words. He knelt beside her, taking her hand gently in his. It was still warm. He whispered, "Thank you," his voice breaking softly. Outside, the wind moved through the fields, carrying with it the faint sound of the church bell from town. They buried her beside Walter, on a hill that overlooked the wheat fields. The sky was clear that day, the air bright and cool. The pastor spoke simple words, and the people who had known her all their lives stood quietly, their heads bowed. James placed her Bible on the casket before it was lowered, the same Bible that had carried Samuel's message for decades. The girls each placed a single flower on top, a lily, a daisy, and a rose. That evening, as the sun dipped low, James walked through Grace's garden, the small patch of earth they had tended together behind his barn. The soil was frozen, but he could still see the faint outlines of where the flowers would bloom again come spring. He knelt and brushed the snow aside with his hand, whispering, "You kept your promise, Helen. You brought peace." Years later, when the garden grew full and bright, Clara often brought the grandchildren there to play. The girls, now grown, would tell them about the woman who had taught their family what forgiveness truly meant. They called it Grandma Helen's Field, and every spring, when the flowers opened again, they said it was her way of reminding them that love, once planted, never dies. One summer afternoon, decades after Helen's passing, one of her great-granddaughters found the old letters preserved in the county library. She sat by the glass case reading them, her reflection mixing with the faded ink. When she reached the last line of Samuel's final letter, she whispered it aloud to herself, "I believe God lets love circle back, even when we think it's gone." Outside the library, the fields of Boone Hollow shimmered under the sun, and a soft wind moved through the tall grass, the same wind that had once passed through Helen's farmhouse, through Samuel's hands, through every life their love had touched. The world had changed, yet its heart was the same, because some truths, as Samuel wrote, cannot be buried by silence, and love, quiet, patient, forgiving, never truly ends. Thank you for joining us in this story of faith and redemption. If it touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who believes in second chances. Sometimes, the most incredible stories are the ones that truly happened.